Hi friends, welcome back or welcome if you're new here. My name is Stacy and I am the Chapter Conundrum. And in today's video, we have a fun one because we are going to be talking about my worst books of 2025. Now, I only have 8 to put on this list today instead of 10 because I only had 8 that were less than a 3-star rating for me. And I feel like putting a 3-star book on your worst of the year is a little bit like aggressive. I guess I suppose I could have picked like the worst of my 3-star books, but I don't know. I just felt like let's just keep this at 8 and talk about the ones that I truly thought were the worst. I will also caveat that a lot of these are not necessarily bad books. A lot of them are just books that don't fit into things that I enjoy or books that don't really fit into like my style of reading. Things that don't work for me for specific reasons, but we'll get into that as we talk about the books. And I have also put these in a ranking of like the least worst to the worst. So to kick things off, coming in the number 8 spot, we have The Last House on Needless Street by Catriona Ward. And this is a really hard one to describe or even hint at describing without spoilers. So I'm just going to read you the Storygraph tagline because I feel like it's going to do it a lot more justice than I can. And this is the story of a serial killer, a stolen child, revenge, death, and an ordinary house at the end of an ordinary street. All these things are true, and yet they are all lies. And I think the best way that I can explain my frustration with this one is to give you kind of like a metaphor for what the reading experience felt like to me. And the best way I can describe it is like it felt like I was doing a jigsaw puzzle without knowing what the picture was. And eventually, as I kept reading, I felt like I got the gist of like what the overall picture would be, but I never got to fill in a lot of the detail of the picture or finish the puzzle and just kind of figure out what all the details were. So it ultimately left me feeling really frustrated. So I felt like the narration was almost talking in code. Like all the words were really understandable, but they didn't really make a whole lot of sense until you kind of got enough time with this character to start decoding like what they were meaning when they were saying certain things. So while I did eventually feel like, okay, I get the gist of what they're trying to explain and what they're experiencing, like I just felt really frustrated because I didn't get the detail or the nuance into what they were experiencing because I never fully cracked the code. And so ultimately, this one definitely left me feeling more frustrated than anything. Now, I will say, I do acknowledge that there is going to be an audience for this book that's going to love it. I am just not one of those people who likes having intangible or unexplainable kind of like darker horror reads. I prefer to have a very like vivid explained character experience to pull me into the tension of a horror. And so this is definitely like a personal taste thing. But yeah, this one just was very frustrating for me ultimately. Coming in the number 7 spot, we've got to talk about The Man Made of Smoke by Alex North. And this one was a disappointment for me because I've previously read and enjoyed The Whisper Man. I will say that one did take me a while to get invested into, and I was kind of anticipating this similar sort of pacing stuff with Man Made of Smoke with how it started off kind of more slowly. But before we get into all that, I guess I should tell you what it's all about. So in here you follow Dan, and when he was a kid, he had like a near chance miss escape sort of scenario with a notorious serial killer slash kidnapper. And it really kind of changed his life, and it was sort of the catalyst for who he became. So he ended up deciding to become a criminal profiler, and his dad is a retired police officer who has disappeared, but we figure out, or Dan knows, that he was investigating kind of like the cold case of this serial killer that he had a near chance miss with when he was younger. And so this story really follows Dan trying to figure out what happened to his father and why his father has disappeared. But yeah, so as I was explaining before that, I enjoyed The Whisper Man, but it did take me a while to get invested into. There was kind of a game changer moment in that one that really drew me in. And so as I was reading this one, I kept waiting for there to be that sort of similar catalyst that drew me in. And I think that's why I didn't end up DNFing it ultimately, even though I maybe should have. I ended up just feeling really apathetic about this one, and I just didn't really care a whole lot. Like, I honestly don't remember a ton about it. I do remember feeling like the ending was rushed and that it had some bizarre pacing because it just felt like a way different pacing than the rest of the book. I felt like we kind of had a slow build and like a slow investigation leading up to like, oh, it's over. So just the juxtaposition of the pacing and the different parts of it, I remember feeling weird. But yeah, overall, I don't really remember any more details. It was very forgettable for me and it just didn't capture my interest. Moving on to number 6, we've got to talk about The Minders by John Marrs. And this one makes me sad because it's part of the One universe, which has one of my all-time favorite thrillers in it, The Passengers, like right before it. So what the heck? It was just kind of strange to go from like an all-time favorite to a book that I should have DNF'd. And I actually contemplated DNFing it when I was reading it, but I held off because I knew it was part of this universe and I knew there were more books out in it, and I didn't know if I was going to kind of like miss out on experiencing some moments or Easter eggs in those other installments if I did DNF The Minders. The answer was no, I would not have. So if you are in this scenario, feel free to DNF The Minders guilt free because, yeah, it wasn't necessary. But essentially, in here, you have a scenario where hackers and hacking in general is very prevalent, and a lot of governments have been subject to this. And so the UK decides that in order to protect themselves from being hacked, they're going to store data within certain humans instead of through computers. And these humans are known as the Minders. And it's kind of rumored that like these Minders know basically everything there is to know, like all the confidential stuff, all the classified stuff, everything in that vein. And so I was hoping that we were going to have some really interesting political moments in this plot, or that we were going to have some information leaked, or like some hints at like some information being threatening at least. But instead, we really follow the characters who are the Minders and sort of like what their day to day experience being a Minder is like. It kind of turns into some action moments where they have like a close run in with somebody like finding out that they're a Minder maybe and how they're reacting to that. But ultimately, this was just boring for me because it focused so much on the character experience, and I'm really not a character reader. I'm more of a plot reader. Like, to put this in perspective, I was rooting for the villains to actually accomplish something so that I would be less bored when I was reading this. And that is not how you want to feel. Like, I was hoping we would get some juicy info and see the government kind of scramble with the consequences of that. Even if it was just like about the foreign governments that aren't the ones who have Minders, and just like how bad the situation is in terms of like hacking being prevalent around the world. Like anything would have been more interesting than what we got, in my opinion. So yeah, this one was just a dud for me, sadly. I think it's even more frustrating that in hindsight, like after reading The Marriage Act and The Family Experiment, which come later on in the same universe, like it's even more frustrating that this is part of the same series, because if you really take the time to think about this happening in the same universe as those stories, like the implications of some things in those should have been different based on what we know and what we have experienced from this story. So it was just kind of like, ugh. Like, I didn't like the book. I didn't like the ramifications it had for the universe, and it was just a frustration for me. Coming in at the number 5 spot, we have Pines by Blake Crouch. And in here, you follow a man, I think he's a husband and a father, who goes to Wayward Pines. I forget why now. I read this back in April, so I'm a little bit fuzzy on the details of the synopsis here. But essentially, he finds himself unable to leave this town. And it's kind of just like his crazy experience of like what's happening and everything going wrong in this town. And I think this one was a massive disappointment for me, specifically because I really enjoy Blake Crouch's standalone books. Like, I have read, I think, 3 of those and enjoyed them all, like Upgrade, Dark Matter, and what's the one with the yellow cover? I don't know. My sick brain cannot compute right now. I'm sure you'll know what I'm talking about, and editing me will put the cover. Anyhow, this just felt very different to me because it was super, super descriptive. Like, he spent so much time describing everything in lengthy chunks, and there was just no context for what was happening up front. Like, it was really frustrating that we find out kind of like the gist of what was going on, or like the reasoning for everything after the fact, because it made me not invested in the experience as I was reading it. I guess if you're somebody who enjoys finding things out in hindsight a lot in terms of like the whole book and like the whole meaning behind the book, and you enjoy like putting together a puzzle of what is happening, then you would probably enjoy this read. But I do not tend to enjoy that reading experience. And so for me, this was really frustrating and ultimately disappointing because it was so different than his other books that I had read. Coming in at number 4, we have Hang the Moon by Jeanette Walls. And she's somebody I've read 4 books from now. And I find my reading experience with her is polarizing. So I tend to enjoy her more nonfiction or nonfiction leaning books and tend to not really enjoy her fictitious work. And now that I know that, I'm better armed to decide what of hers I would pick up in the future, depending on what she comes out with. And this is a historical fiction set in Prohibition era Virginia. And in here, you follow the daughter of a prominent man in town. I think he's known as the Duke. I don't know if he actually was a Duke. I can't remember the details anymore. But anyhow, she does not really fit into societal norms. And a lot of this is her coming of age story and kind of how she's coping with and also fighting back and kind of like pushing back against those things and what her own sort of moral codes are and how those are formed. A lot of this kind of read like it was a Spark Notes version of a lot of things that happened to her. Like I just needed a whole lot more nuance and detail to this for me to get invested, I think. And it was frustrating ultimately because I enjoy her writing style, but just the way that this one unfolded, it was lacking in a lot of ways for me. Like I just didn't get that invested in the character. The plot was really lackluster, and I'm not the biggest fan of historical fiction to start with. So, yeah, this one ultimately was just a dud for me. Coming in at the number 3 spot, I'm sad to say that we had a 2025 release Thrill, Chill, or Kill pick, and that is Beautiful Ugly by Alice Feeney. And this one just no. In here, you follow Grady, who is an author, and he's working from home or at home. Anyway, his wife is on the way home from whatever she's doing, and they're on the phone, and he hears her have some kind of incident with the car when she's like almost home. And so he runs out of the house and goes to try and figure out what's happened. And he gets to the scene, and her car is there, her phone is there, but she has disappeared. And then you kind of have like a time jump. I think it's a year. And eventually he starts to get back into writing, but he's really struggling. Like he's got a block. And he ends up traveling to his agent's like cabin on a remote island setting and just like have a change of scenery to try and get some more writing done. And on this island, he runs into a woman who looks exactly like his missing wife. So a lot of this is just like him trying to figure out and cope with what happened. And the writing style in here was good. It's the only reason it didn't get a 1-star rating from me, honestly. I felt like for the first whole chunk of the story, like all the tension in the story and some of the plot points were kind of like really repetitive. It was kind of like, oh, he kept thinking it was his missing wife, and then like something would happen. He'd have a close run in again, think he saw his wife. Is it her? Trying to figure that out. You know, it was just a lot of that over and over in different scenarios. And so it got really annoying. But then you got to the twist. And I can't tell you, like, I hated the reveal of this one. Not only was it like, come on, really? But it also introduced like logical flaws in everything that we were told earlier, because it was like, well, if this is what's happening, then this other thing over here didn't make any sense. And it was almost like she didn't really know what the twist was when she was writing this book, and then like slapped it on later and didn't like go back to edit it to make sure it made any kind of sense. It was just very frustrating in general and ultimately made me angry. I will say there is a fun Easter egg in this one where if you read like the first word of the first, I think it's 14 chapters, you get a message. If you've read it, you'll know what I'm talking about because the ending like alludes to this being a thing. So that was kind of interesting. But like that was pretty much the only redeeming quality of this book other than Alice Feeney's prose. I think this one is ultimately extra disappointing because I have also read and enjoyed like several Alice Feeney books in the past. Like His and Hers is my favorite of hers that I have read, but I also liked Daisy Darker and Rock Paper Scissors. So yeah, just sucked. Coming in the number 2 spot, we have Something Wilder by Christina Lauren. And this is a contemporary second chance romance following a girl who gives like treasure hunting tours in the desert on horseback. And I think one of the guests on the tour is somebody she knew from her past, and it's kind of like their second chance deal. And the setup with that was interesting. Like, I wasn't mad about that. But then you get into like the second half of this book, and honestly, it felt like a bad Nancy Drew story with romance that didn't need to be there, and it was just really frustrating. Like, this book should not have been written as a romance because all of the tension and stakes were completely non-existent because this is marketed as romance. You know that it's going to have a happily ever after. So you know nothing can happen to the two main characters involved here in all of these scenarios that are like supposedly high stakes and dangerous. And it was just like really eye rolly and frustrating for that reason. On top of that, you had things introduced that like their happily ever after really hinged on the events of like what was happening, and it was just like, come on. Like, I know some people say journey over destination, but when you entirely know the destination as you're on this journey and you're just not having a good time, like, it was not fun for me. And I have previously read and loved Christina Lauren books, even their second chance books, which is not my favorite romance trope. Like, I really like Love in Other Words, but Something Wilder, honestly, I read the author's note when I finished this one, and they were saying they had written it like during the era of lockdown and COVID. And that kind of made sense because they were trying to have something more like light and fluffy that didn't take itself too seriously, that didn't really have a lot of stakes, and they just wanted it to be like a feel good story, I think. But like, it just frustrated me. All I could think was I would rather be going back to my childhood and playing The Secret of Shadow Ranch, in like the second half of that was better than this story for sure. This felt like a cheapened, watered down, crappy version of that. And then coming in at my number one spot, my least favorite worst read of the year, we've got to talk about The Things Gods Break by Abigail Owen, the second book in the Crucible trilogy. And this one makes me sad because I read book one, The Games Gods Play, in October, and I had a really good time with it. I gave it a 3.5 star. I really enjoyed the trials aspect of it. And I guess I should explain that it follows our main character who is chosen by Hades to compete in trials to determine who the next ruling Greek god will be. And that one really just follows like the trials and sort of like how all of that competition aspect goes, and also kind of like her getting to know Hades and getting to know a little bit more about how the Greek gods have operated in the past and sort of like the rivalries and relationships they have within each other. So there's a bit of political intrigue that way. This one, though, picks up right where the end of book one left us, which I liked, but really rapidly introduces something that's completely a mindfuck. And all logic kind of goes out the window from there. So you get like a very basic explanation as to like what is happening. But then it continues without explanation as to why it's continuing, what's happening, what's going on. We don't know. This character is jumping around from scene to scene, not even in chronological order. It's very confusing. You feel like you have whiplash, and it just feels super manufactured so that the author could inject you into moments with these characters and just give you like an emotional experience of character moments over and over and over and over and over for like forever long in this book. And as somebody who's not a character reader, that was beyond frustrating for me. I wanted an explanation. I wanted context for the plot. I wanted a plot that was a little bit more than what we got here. I will say we did eventually get some answers later on down the road where you do, in hindsight, kind of get a better understanding of why this is happening and like what the deal is. But honestly, it was just frustrating. Like, I don't like fever dream, whiplash, don't really know what's going on, intangible kind of books. And to have a sequel in a series that I was enjoying do this was just even more sucky. I've definitely decided I'm done with the series and I'm not picking up book three when it comes out next year, even regardless of what kind of reviews it gets, and even if my complaints are solved. Because, like, I'm just like, no, I can tell the author just doesn't have the same priorities that I do in what I like to read. And I feel like at this point, they're never going to be an all time favorite for me. So it's just frustrating. I can't really tell you any more detail as to like why I felt this way or like what is happening in the book because I feel like it's super spoilery, not only for book two, but also for the ending of book one. But suffice it to say that like It just wasn't for me at all. If you're a character reader, maybe you would love this. But for me, the story just didn't have an organic flow. It was frustrating and I was just confused and like did not care about the character moments. It was just not a good time. But yeah, enough of my ranting. Let me know down below in the comments what some of your most disappointing and worst books of the year are. Definitely let me know if you have any booktubers you go to for their worst book videos to get recommendations, because you know you have different tastes to them. Like there are definitely channels that I have gone to in the past to get recommendations from their disrecommended worst books, because I know I have opposite tastes to them, and I always find that kind of fun. Reading is super subjective and to each their own, right? I feel like as long as somebody's explaining why something didn't work for them, you might get a good sense of why it could work for you and why it could be exciting for you. So I definitely feel like worst books of the year videos are definitely still valuable content, even if you are not necessarily a negative type person. But yeah, at this point, I'm just off on a tangent. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on your way out if you want to, and have a great day. Bye.